Am I coming through okay? Not too loud? Okay. Okay, so I'm always a little bit nervous the first time you do this every year. It's kind of like you're starting over something that you haven't done for a long time, so I'm kind of shaky out here, but I'll be okay. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. The very first week, a week ago, last Monday, we had our first day, and on Tuesday the governor gave her State of the State speech, condition of the state speech, I should say, and it was well received. A couple things, a couple highlights from that speech, and the governor in her speech was again very vocal about her support for rural Iowa, about doing things that she thinks will, and I think we all agree, will help rural Iowa. One thing that that she mentioned in her speech was she's requesting $15 million for broadband, and that's to supply grants and things like that for companies that are willing to put broadband into smaller communities. And that's where it really hurts, or really hits us hard, is smaller communities. It's hard for any company to go in a very, very small community and supply broadband for the cost. And the return it's hard to do, so I think there needs to be some help. Broadband is becoming more and more of an issue in smaller communities, and I think it's making it tougher for businesses to stay in small communities, because you need fast, that's the way the society is going. That's the way our businesses are growing, is through that ability to do that, so it's very important for the state. She mentioned child care, and that's something that the Republican caucus, I know in the House, and I'm sure in the Senate too, is aware that we have a cliff effect with child care, and the cliff effect is hurting, it's hurting people that want to get out there and work, because there's situations where, and this is documented, there's people that have said that they either have to refuse to take a raise, because if they get an extra $2 or $1 an hour, all of a sudden they lose all the child care. And it ends up becoming a very expensive raise that they got from the company that gave it to them. Or else they may say, well, I'll take the raise, but I want to go down to 36 hours or things like that. So that's not good for the economic growth of the state when we're already short of workers. So I think we're going to look at the cliff effect and try to say, okay, you're never going to be financially burdened by taking a raise or by moving up the ladder. I think that's very important also. She encouraged us to set the budget for K-12 early, which we try to do every year, and I think we've done a better job of that about the last 2 or 3 years than what we had done in the past. And so we're going to continue to try to get that K-12 budget set very early, so that our schools know what they got to work with next year. She recommended a 2.5% increase, which I believe is about $100 million, an increase in K-12 funding. And then also something that's very near and dear to my heart is she wants to get us to the point where transportation for schools that have high transportation costs are brought down to the state average. And we started working on that about 2 or 3 years ago. We haven't got those high dollar schools down to the state average yet, but I think there's a good chance we'll get them down to the state average this year. If you'll recall, I mentioned this I think 3 years ago, we had schools that had around $800 per student average that it took to get them to school via the bus. And the state average, I believe, is around $250. So we're trying to get the really high cost schools down, because that's costing them money in the classroom, because that comes out of general fund. And so if you have a school with $50 per student classroom, per student cost to get them to school, and then you've got a school with $950 per student, that school really is unfair, because it takes them $900 more that they cannot use in the classroom that other schools can. So that's a good one. Overall, I was pleased with her speech. I thought it was good. She's still working on felon voting rights, which I think is something that we need to move on. I agree that we have to find some kind of common ground. I think we might be the only state, or maybe one of 2 states, that a felon has to go directly through the governor and ask for permission to vote. In other states, it's automatic when you've paid your dues, you've paid your time, and you've done restitution, you automatically get to vote. And so we're working on some type of common ground that we can all agree on. I think that there's probably some people that should never vote, and the very worst of the worst, but I think that there's a vast majority of them that do deserve the right to come back and vote again once they've done their time and paid the price. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll let Mark talk.
Thank you, Brian. Brian says he only gets nervous for the first one. Well, I've been doing this 8 years. I'm nervous every time. Maybe that's good for your heart, I don't know. I think it probably is. It raises your blood pressure and lowers it. And I've always compared this to a semester test in high school. A forum is just like having a weekly semester test, because I'm expected to know everything about everything. And no matter how long I study on Friday afternoons and Friday nights, I've always done the wrong thing. Maybe that's why I was the student that I was in high school, I don't know. But it's great to be back with you and see all your faces here at New Hope, which is always a wonderful host for this, and appreciate it very much. Brian has pretty well covered the governor's condition of the state address, and there's only one thing I would add, and it's pretty much deals with question number 2, so I'll try to, but if I don't read this to you, I don't want to put words in the governor's mouth, because she's proposing an idea that's been out there for a long time. And the idea was called I Will. And that was a appropriation bill that was that passed actually in 2010 by the public voting on it. It was supposed to be 3/8, the next 3/8 of a cent in the next raise in the state sales tax would go to conservation measures, water quality being one, and public parks and that sort of thing. And that 3/8 of a cent would raise $200 million a year. So kind of keep that in mind. It's kind of amazing to me that 3/8 of a penny would raise $200 million. So along comes regional mental health and mental health funding for adults with disabilities and that sort of thing. And that's been around for a long time, and that has been funded through local property taxes, basically from the get-go. So there's been lawsuits in the past few years. About the time I became a legislator, there was a lawsuit that said every service that is offered in my county must be offered in the other counties. So before we had 99 different systems of mental health, how to care for mental health. And since that law was passed, we've gone to 14 regions, which a region is a conglomerate of counties that join together and pool their money so that they can provide these core services that was required by that change in the law and that lawsuit back in the early 2000s. So she's proposing, and this is something, and I shouldn't go in this too far because I won't have anything left to say for number 2, but she's proposing this. Over the last 2 years, the governor and legislature have added 27 new services to the regional mental health and disability services system, including new services for adults with complex needs and an array of services for children. That's the new one that was added last year. But there was no funding that went with that. So she's proposing a mechanism to fund that this year, and she's using the I will idea, because if we raise it a penny, 3/8 goes to the conservation part of that, and that leaves another 5/8 in that first penny to use somewhere else. And this problem of how do we fund mental health, and we keep adding core services there. There were 7 new core services added there a few years ago. How do we fund that? Because it's all relying on local property tax to do that, and you know how high local property tax is getting. So she's proposing taking the funding mechanism that was set up 4 years ago would require counties to, it would limit them to $47.28 per capita. That was the maximum amount of property tax money they could raise for mental health issues. She's proposing to lower that to $12.50. Now, I just got this memo last night, so this is news that I wasn't aware of to start the weekend. So counties will be able to collect $12.50 per person living in the county from property taxes. That's what is called a per capita levy. Right now, counties collect between $25 to $47.28 per capita, so this is a significant cut in property taxes. Going down to 12.5 from 47.28 is about $77 million that you wouldn't raise. You would cut property taxes that much. But the rest of the story is the $12.50 per capita tax will bring in about $40 million to the system. So the system needs about $125 million. Let me continue to read this because I'll get it all messed up otherwise. The state will give the mental health regions $80 million of the money collected from this new sales tax. So that will take up the gap of that, lowering that property tax from $47.28 down to $12.50. That will pick up the difference there. This would be distributed by population, so regions would receive about 25.43 cents per person. The governor's plan was to increase the base amount by $15 million over the next 2 years, $10 million more in 2022 and $5 million more in 2023 to help pay the new services that must be started in. Regions are currently spending $112 million on services. This plan will bring in about $40 million in local property taxes and $80 million in state funds for a total of $120 million. That amount increases to $130 million the next year and $135 million the year following. So her plan will increase funding for mental health regions. It will lower property taxes, and it all relies on that 1 cent increase in sales taxes to do that. And with that, I'll stop. And there's many other things we could talk about here, but probably the first bill that we're really working on now as a group is the pro-life amendment to the Constitution, the Iowa Constitution. It basically says, it's just an amendment that says there's nothing in the Iowa Constitution that says you have a right to an abortion. Last year this resolution was passed. In order for an amendment to be made to the Iowa Constitution, you have to have 2 years in 2 different sessions to pass an amendment that would go on to the Iowa Constitution. Okay, so passing this year will make that 2-year requirement. And if that happens, then it goes to the vote of the people. So the people will have the final say on whether that's put into the Iowa Constitution. It's not something that we can do as a legislature. We can only set the mechanism up to allow you to vote on that. So I think that's an important thing to note, and I'll stop now. So thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Our first question of 2 this morning is really from New Hope. Direct support staff care for over 160,000 Iowans with disability or mental health need an average starting wage of $10.94 or $438 per week. Will you support a bill that requests an increase in wages for professionals who provide assistance to people with physical and intellectual disabilities?
Okay, I have a few questions to start out with because I've gotten conflicting information. Right now, I think that the average wage in Iowa for these workers is $10.94. Is Rhonda, is that true?
I'm right here. This is data that was collected by our state association, the Iowa Association of Community Providers. And they collected both a rural average wage and a urban average wage. And of course the urban average wage is a little bit higher, but this is the rural average wage that they found when they surveyed providers like us, which are about 140 in Iowa.
Okay, that clears that up. So The starting wage currently is $10.94, that's what you're.
Average.
Average, yeah. And that amounts to $438 per week if you do the math
40
for
40 hours.
40 hours, okay. All right, and this group of people are typically, and I'm looking at Rhonda again because she knows the answer to
I'll
this,
stand up.
are trained, or are they typically CNAs, certified nursing assistants, which they don't have to be a
They don't
certified.
have to be a CNA. We provide quite extensive training here as they begin working with us.
Mm-hmm. And they can work their way to being a certified nursing assistant if they take the right courses and pass the test.
Yes.
As well. And there is currently a registry for certified nursing assistants in Iowa, I do believe, but there isn't one for direct care workers.
There is not, but I would ask you if you would focus on the wage.
Okay, the long story's getting longer here. Thanks, Rhonda. I appreciate your help. Before the session started this January, I was down for a meeting. I think it was our one caucus meeting before the session started. And I ran into, we have a chairman this year for Human Resources, which is Annette Sweeney. Senator Sweeney has been in the Senate now for 2 years. She replaced Bill Dix when he resigned. She had been in the House for 4 years before that, and she worked for USDA Rural Development, I think at the time when she ran for that seat in the Senate. So she's the new Human Resources Chair, and last year it was Marionette Miller Meeks, who was Dr. Marionette Miller Meeks, by the way, and I had been their chairman for that committee for the 2 years before that, but I don't have a doctor in front of my name, so I immediately thought, here's the perfect person to be the chairman of that committee, and she did a bang-up job, but now she's running for Congress, so I'm training another chairman in Annette Sweeney, and I think she'll be fine. She's got a lot of experience already, just how to handle a committee and that sort of thing. So now I'm way off track. But the bill requests an increase of wages for professionals who provide assistance. So a professional here would be a CNA.
Another term for direct care staff is direct support professionals. They're trying to elevate the position and give the position credit for the work that the very important work that they do, but it's the same position. It's our direct care workers.
Okay, thank you again, Rhonda.
Yep.
So I got to back up the boat. My story about telling about Annette Sweeney was the fact that at our first caucus meeting, when I went into our little staff room there, I ran into Annette Sweeney talking to Di Finley. Di Finley is the lobbyist for direct care workers in Iowa. And she says, oh, good, why don't you sit down and join us? And so I did. And so first bill I co-sponsored this year is one to set up a registry. Now, you're talking about wages. This registry for direct care workers in Iowa, and I'll probably be ending up running that bill on the floor. Why is that important? Because of the job market. One of your points, I think, was the fact that you're losing almost 50% of your workers on a...
That is the survey that's statewide. That is not New Hope data.
Okay. But there's...
Statewide, it is one of every 2 workers leave within the first 12 months.
And how do you replace them? Well, that's a big challenge for facilities like New Hope to find those workers. And this directory would put their names and register them in there, and it would speed up the process as far as hiring new help for your positions. So that's important. And now the wage increase, I hate to pass something that requires a nonprofit entity to pay a wage that they may not be able to afford. So there's a little hesitancy on my part to require that. And now she's smiling and raising her hand, so go ahead.
The bill includes a pass-through of the funds that come in through the rates that they must be paid to our direct care workforce. So it doesn't put the choice on us of how we spend those dollars. It requires it.
Okay. I think I can probably unequivocally say I will be supporting that bill, and you can ask Rhonda a few questions now.
Thank you.
Okay, I believe that really the main thing is that we just need to look at the issue and deal with it, and I think it's probably going to cost a little bit more money. It's going to have to either be take more money out of the general fund and get it into HHS budget, where, because in the end, we can say you have to do it, but we have to fund it too. And so I think that's going to basically raise the floor rates and things like that, but they need to be kept up with the times. We're behind. There's no doubt about that. We've got, as Rhonda attests to, you know, the amount of turnover and the cost of replacing workers and the cost of training new workers. It's just really kind of a system that's just so far behind the rate of pay that should be out there that I'd be for this, absolutely. But I think it just, from a historical standpoint, we just haven't been staying up to date with the cost of what it takes labor-wise in this area. And so, yeah, I will support it. The beef I've kind of got right now, and this is something that really kind of bothers me, is that the federal government and the Supreme Court and all these people who have good intentions are doing things that really raise the cost of what we're asking places like New Hope Village to do. And so, you know, the Olmstead Act, which was a great thing on the face of it, saying that you have to get people out into the community, whatever it takes. You can't let them stay in a residential care facility. They have to be in a house. You have to find work for them. And at the same time, they say that the work has to pay a certain amount. And so you've got employers out there that would be willing to let residents and the folks from New Hope Village come in and work, but they can't afford to pay them minimum wage. Or they're saying that they have to work in certain environments and they can't be more than, what, 3 or 4 go to the same place. And so, I mean, they're really tying the hands of what common sense would tell us what to do. Another example is the Redemption Center in Denison, where they had to close down because they could no longer use or hire the folks that were local, that were special needs folks that were going in there and working. And so, you know, those are things that really raise the cost of what we're trying to do. And so we've got to keep the wages up for the direct care staff. So again, I agree. Is there a bill right now that's being brought forward?
Yes, I apologize, I don't know the number of it, but I will get it to you.
And Rhonda promised to let me know what the number of that bill was, but I think it might be a House file like 201 or something like that. But okay, I guess that's my final comment there. But
All right, our second question this morning then is, where are your priorities with the governor's 1 cent increase in sales tax?
I can go first since I've talked about this a lot already. The governor's proposal, will that actually happen? It's going to be a reach. I've supported this idea from 4 years already, and it got to the point a year ago that I actually asked a draft to be made that would allow us to do the I will and intend the money that's the overage in that to go towards the mental health issues. So I had it drafted. I never dropped it. I dropped it in Randy Feenstra, who was the Ways and Means Committee chairman, who decides all those kind of, that's not something that Human Resources can pass as a good idea, but it's not something that you can make a law, because all those spending bills go to Ways and Means first, and it has to go through their group before it can move forward. So it's the same thing that happened to me in my bottle bill. The bottle bill now is still in Ways and Means, and I dropped by the chairman's desk, who is Jake Chapman in the Senate anyway, and keep reminding me every day that he could certainly run a subcommittee on that and improve on it if he wants. We just need to get it done. So I'm off of the subject here. And so my priority is, if we can get this somewhere to help relieve property tax in the rural areas, We had an interesting discussion in our Human Resources Committee meeting the other day with Joe Bolcom. Joe Bolcom is the senator from Iowa City. And he objected to the thought that the rural areas weren't paying their. He says, well, in my county, the urban areas pay for 80% of the mental health costs. Well, Joe, you have 200,000 people in your county. 99% of the counties in Iowa have maybe 10,000 people in them, and not the housing and the businesses that you would have in Iowa City or Des Moines or Cedar Rapids or Cedar Falls. Those places have great mental health budgets, really don't need this because their property base is large enough to cover all that. They have all those services because they have all that money. And so that was an interesting discussion on my part, so for him to hear. And I continue to work on that. So I'm supporting this. I don't know whether it's going to be 3/8 of a cent. There's going to be changes in the formula, I'm sure, as it comes down the pike, and how much it will actually reduce property tax. But it's not going to be easy to do that because we already have 7-cent sales tax, and we make it another penny, we'll have up to 8-cent sales tax, which will probably put us higher than any county or any state around us, and that's never a good thing. So.
I think my priorities with the 1 cent tax is pretty much, I agree with what the governor is doing, and 3/8 of it constitutionally has to go towards water quality and recreational, those types of things. So I mean, that's already baked into the cake. I think it's going to be a real challenge. It's going to be a heavy lift to try to get this passed. And I think you all probably know my email. If you don't, it's real easy. It's brian.best@legis.iowa.gov. And I'd be interested in hearing what everybody in this room thinks about raising an extra 1 cent. I think there's two ways you can look at this. We can do some of these things. Actually, the mental health relief, tax relief part would probably be hard to do without the 1 cent. But everything else, there's money in the general fund, I think, to fund a lot of these things without having to raise the 1 cent. Like we're talking about the 3/8 cents. There's money that could be put, maybe not the full 3/8 cents is $200 million. We may not be able to put $200 million into iWill, but we could put a good portion of money into iWill just from our general fund collections. And I think we should look at that as a possibility also, as opposed to raising 1 cent. I was looking at some of the sales tax of surrounding states, and I've got a graph here. It shows North Dakota at 5%, South Dakota 4.5%, Nebraska 5.5%, Kansas 6.5%, Minnesota 6.88%, so that's the closest to us at 7 right now. And then we're going to raise another penny. Missouri is 4.23%. And it may not be a true apples to apples because we do not tax groceries in the state of Iowa, food. I believe some of these states might tax them, so it may wash out to some degree. But still, 8%, it just kind of gives me a little sticker shock. I've not decided yet where I'm at on this, but I am very interested in what my constituents think about the idea. Any ideas you have, I'd be more than happy to. You come up and talk to me afterwards, or you can use my email to send me a message.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Now we'll take some time for questions from the floor. If you do have a question, please raise your hand. And if you are chosen, would you please say who you are, and if your question represents an organization other than yourself, please tell us what that organization is. Basically, what I'm trying to say is this is not the time to lobby them for whatever you want them to pass, all right? Rhonda, because she was the host, got her question up front, so that's okay. All right, and if you have something that is not a question that you want to twist one of their arms, please wait until afterwards and do that, all right? So, any questions from the floor? Virginia?
What's the status of including all kids in school choice? And funding the, no, it's just public schools.
Oh, you mean, the question is, what is the status on school choice for kids? And so you're talking about like a voucher program that would follow the student wherever they wanted to go?
Well, approved school.
Yeah, yeah. So a private school they could go to and still have the same funding as what you get at a public school. I don't see that there's a whole lot of legs for that right now. I'm not on the education committee, but that was discussed a year or two ago, and maybe 3 years ago, I don't remember, but when it was an all-out discussion about what some folks would call a voucher program, or they renamed it, I'm not sure what they're calling it now. I don't think that there's a whole lot of will to do anything more than what we're doing right now. I think there's a will to give incentives for folks that want to contribute money to private schools. And I think that's a good idea. I think that's a good way to go. And I'm not saying that, I don't know what it's like in the Senate, but I don't hear anything about it in the House at this point.
In the Senate, we have some senators that have worked on this issue in the past and are friendly to it, but it's a hard push to get it done. So I don't see it going anywhere this year either. Jerry Bain has led the charge on that, and Jerry Bain is from Boone, and Jerry Bain was a senator for our area here back 10 years ago. So we discuss it on occasion, but it's never had a bill that's gotten to the floor. As you might imagine, it's pretty controversial. So the good news is here that those nonprofit schools usually can do the same thing and teach their classes and perform what they need to perform at a lower cost than what public schools can. Seems like our public schools are administratively challenged. They have more administrators than they have teachers on many occasions, and the money just goes for. We've been trying to give school boards more power so that they can make some decisions that makes a difference. But sadly, school boards usually follow the direction of their administrator. I've never been on a school board, and God bless anybody here that was on one. I know you know what I'm talking about. So it's a challenge, but God bless those nonprofit schools for what they're doing. They are about 250,000 children in private schools in Iowa, I think. I'd have to check that number for sure, but there's a large number, and they save the state a lot of money. And we've been throwing money at schools since we've had the majority. We've never reneged on one dime that was promised, and we're kind of proud of that. I've got the number here, but I don't know if I can lay my fingers right on it as I'm talking about it. So, next question. Did you have a chance, Brian?
Yeah, I talked. Please.
Hi, I'm Annie Inkabel, and I'm a junior at Spelled High School. And I'm actually in Youth Congress, or Iowa Youth Congress. And my group was working on trying to get the tax off of women products because it's not very equal. And a lot of low-income people can't really get the things that they need. And also, it's kind of like a burden to them. And how do you feel about this, being like a luxury tax instead of no tax?
I'm not sure I follow.
Women's products.
Well, the question's about like feminine hygiene products and things
Yes.
like that, and the tax that's on them now.
Yes.
I know that part of our caucus discussion right now is diapers and as well as feminine hygiene products, and to make them a non-taxable entity. And I think there's a pretty good chance that that might go through this year. I think it's about $4 million that it would, how much money the state would not collect if we were to do that. So I think it's something that's being looked at. I think it's actually part of the governor's plan too. So there's a pretty good chance that they may go somewhere with that this year.
Thanks for the question, now that I understand what you're talking about, and I would support it. I think that'd be a good idea, so, okay.
Yes.
I am Annette Custer with the Early Childhood Iowa area. I'm wondering what you're hearing about child care. Iowa Women's Foundation has been across the state of Iowa. I know they've been in Glidden and down in Manning and up in Storm Lake helping address that issue. Have you heard anything on any solutions?
Thanks, Annette. Annette and I have known one another for a long time, so I can call her Annette without getting into trouble. And I'm on the Early Childhood Advisory Committee. They placed me on that last year, so it's becoming a bigger issue at the state level all the time, and there's more discussion this year than there's been since I've been there about the cliff effect that Brian was talking about earlier. So while nobody has mentioned it yet, I see it coming down the pike with something yet this year. So stay tuned in.
Next question. Yes, sir.
Mark Brisselman. First, I'd like to thank both Brian and Mark for what they do. This question concerns Brian. You have in your newsletter you talked about being on the Transportation Committee, and if I could like to read a little bit of quote. Another transportation bill would require rumble strips on all county roads when approaching a stop sign adjacent to a state highway. An example of a state highway would be 141, correct?
Yeah, or Highway 30, I'm assuming would be a state highway, yeah.
And the thing is, has it been talked about how those rumble strips would be with gravel roads? Because a lot of those highways have gravel roads. You know, I can see where in the spring and the fall, those rumble strips would turn into potholes, you know, because usually there are two banks of rumble strips. One, and don't quote me on this because I don't know the exact footage, is like 100 feet from the stop sign, another one say 500 feet. What would those rumble strips do on a gravel road?
Okay, I may not have explained it as well as I could have in the letter that I sent out. The intention is only county blacktops or cement roads would be the only way the only thing that this would affect. This is something that was brought to my committee, and I've assigned it a subcommittee. I'm not sure how much interest there's going to be, but this happened because I know of at least two legislators here in the state where, and this is probably part of the texting issue too on top of it. It could have very well been somebody who was distracted by their phone. They went right through a stop sign and got T-boned by a semi, and apparently in southern Iowa it took out quite a few members of one family. It will, unless there's a way to make it so that the counties don't have to pay for it, because we're talking about county roads, and so anytime something like that happens, it's a little bit, we're putting a mandate on the counties, and we're telling them they have to pay for something that the state is requiring. It's always kind of tough to do an unfunded mandate, so I'm not sure where it's going to go, but I think it definitely deserves, it deserves conversation about it. Part of our job is to try to keep the public as safe as we can, and I think this definitely falls into that.
Could I chime in? Is that okay? Rumble strips, I think, come in two categories. One is just the one that's continuous down the center of the highway. That if you get over out of your lane, you hear it rumble. Those seem to be great ideas, but have you noticed how much they're breaking up now? We may live to regret that that's happening. I think those kind of rumble strips need to be put in there at the time they're putting a new top on a road. They can't be, as they did between Carroll and Denison, something that's done after the fact. It seems like that just opens up a place for water and moisture to get under the pavement and cause damage way quicker than we ever realized. So transportation is a big issue for Iowa, and it always will be when you have frost and hot and cold like we have in Iowa. The only place worse is Minnesota, so I say stay in Iowa, for crying out loud.
Next question, please. Yes, sir.
I'm John Richardson, retired mental health professional, and I have liked to hear your comments on the continued problems we're having with the privatized Medicaid system, especially in light of the push toward trying to improve mental health issues, while at the same time, many mental health centers are facing financial crisis because the savings oftentimes is denial of service, late payments, or reimbursement rates that are below the actual costs. And I would just, and I guess my further along those lines is it something you think that we need additional legislation to take care of, or do you think administratively you'll be able to manage this?
It's a really, really complicated issue in the fact that, we send money to the MCOs, and then we tell the MCOs to do the right thing, and the MCOs say they are doing the right thing, and yet at the same time, they're supposed to be the guardians of the money and make sure it's spent efficiently. And then you turn around and you see a lot of providers that really aren't being treated fairly. So I think we need a ton of transparency. I think what we need to do also on top of that is we need to ask them, okay, it's just like this big secret. We send this money to the MCOs, and they tell us we're not making any money, and then we say, wait, well, how do you know? How do we know if they're making any money or not? It's just, this has been a little frustrating for, I think, everybody down at the State House, to be honest with you. We have to start looking at mental health as just, if we don't start looking at it as something that needs to be treated, like the same way you treat a knee operation or anything like that, it just needs to be treated. It's a condition. It's not that person's fault. It needs to be funded, and we need to start taking care of it. And I know we've done, everybody in this room knows we haven't done a very good job at that. As part of societal thing, I don't think ever since I was a kid, when I was a kid, I'll say, I think we're looking at it differently now. When I was a kid, we looked at mental health like it was a flaw, maybe in this person. It's like, okay, that's just the way they are, or whatever. I think we really got to start funding it, and it's going to take money, and I think that's part of the problem too, is there's always, where do we come up with the money? And sometimes we don't look at it with the right attitude, and so, but if we don't start funding places that are doing these things, we're going to really have a breakdown. And so I think the MCOs have got to be held accountable. We have to realize that it's going to take more money, I believe, regardless if we're talking about MCOs or what we're talking about. It takes a lot of money to fund all the things we want to do on the Medicaid side. So I think we just got to be prepared to fund it and make sure that that's the case. And again, the MCOs have to do, I think, a little bit better job of telling us why they're not paying for some of the things they're not paying for. I get, and this is the big broad picture over and above the mental health issue. I own a business. I'm probably one of the only legislators down there that owns a business where I have to bill MCOs because of the Medicaid population out there. And I can tell you, it's not a pleasant experience for me. And so I can't imagine it's a pleasant experience for anybody to have to try to get them to do the right thing and pay for things that they need to pay for. The whole idea behind the MCOs, by the way, too, was that they were here to kind of make sure that wellness was part of the picture, that the people were given the services they needed so they wouldn't get sick later. And I think that in some cases they're really short-sighted on that too, because you've got to have all these different reasons why you're going to perform a test on somebody, and it seems like if it's just preventative, or if we're trying to get information that's going to help them so they don't get sick down the road, those sometimes are the toughest ones to get covered. And so there's a lot we got to do, but I think there's more awareness than there used to be. It's just, unfortunately, sometimes it takes longer to get to that point than what we'd like, and I think it does take them too long.
Your question is a tough one, and it's one that sort of has been laying in my lap for the last 8 years. The Governor Branstad, as he left the state, signed the bill that would required managed care. Managed care was to take the place of the Iowa Medicaid enterprise, which we still have, by the way, and try to hold down costs. Now, Iowa Medicaid has sort of admitted over the years that they probably approved everything that came down the pike and should have probably said no to a few as they went along, because it was a budget that was basically out of control. And so there's a lot of mental health issues out there that are becoming much more publicly aware of, especially in schools. I suppose that's the tip of the spear right now is we're seeing it in our schools with kids that just go out of control and cause schools to do what they have created a policy now called clear the room, or clear room, where a child acts out like that. They don't discipline that child on the spot. They take all the students out of that room and wait for them to calm down, and then call the proper authorities while they're waiting for that child to calm down. So these are the kind of things that are going on in our schools, and that's why children's mental health, as a part of mental health period, which is funded through the counties and hopefully through the state as well, is such a big issue right now. Now, there's not enough psychiatrists in Iowa to do all the what's the right word here? All the analysis, determine what kind of problem that you have and if there's a medication that you should be on to solve that problem. But they use a thing called telehealth, and I've seen it work here in Carroll, Iowa. They have and I apologize if those people are here today. I can't remember the name of the place. And what's it called?
Well, my business is called Classroom Clinic, providing school-based telehealth services.
And it's school-based. And for children, it seems to work quite well. What I saw, and we actually visited with, we were on the one end here in Carroll and visited with a person that I think was a psychiatrist at Mercy. I'm not sure about that. It was a few years ago. But that worked quite well. But now MCOs do not want to pay for those services like if the person was right there. I think that's an issue. And so we've been trying to put pieces back together through the oversight committee for a long time. But you know, it's a funny thing. They gave us an oversight committee, but they didn't give us the power to really do anything. I mean, we don't even come up with bill suggestions. And when you do, it seems to it disappears in the system and you never hear about it again. So it's a battle, and it's going to continue to be a battle until we get it right. And the MCOs, we're down to just 2 now. And one is basically all the elderly people are in the Iowa Total Care, and they started out by getting about 160,000 of the elderly people into their system. That was basically their clientele. And then I hate to say this, but they didn't really pay a claim for the first month. I think they waited for the money to come in. And how many dollars is that? Well, it was enough that this is something that's not happened before, but just before Christmas, Iowa Medicaid, who kind of oversees the contracts, DHS actually, stop paying them $44 million a month until they get this claim problem figured out. Now, if you can stop paying $44 million a month to one group, how much are we paying for that month? I mean, they still had money to go on, and I don't know the answer to that question, but the biggest budget and the most federal funds in Iowa come to DHS for mental health, and that's billions of dollars, and everything else is in the millions. So it's a huge budget, and I think it needs some investigation even into DHS of where all that money really goes, because it seems like it's not going where it should, and we'll try to fix that. So.
curious if there's gonna be a bottle bill this year. It seems to be something that can fund itself, but yet it seems to be the proverbial can that gets kicked down the road.
That's a good analogy. The bottle bill that I passed last year was just going to add another penny to the redemption centers so that they would get 2 cents for handling and administration instead of 1 cent. Now, nobody can operate at 1 cent. I think I asked my staff person how many redemption centers there were left, and DNR really doesn't track that, but she told me they thought there was like 64 still in business. So the bottle bill now is in Ways and Means because it's a tax, and it has to go through them before it can move on. So I keep pushing on it and encouraging them to do that, but if they don't bring it up, it will die for this session and have to start all over, which means, every 2 years you have an election. Well, it means there's a different group of legislators probably in the next term than there was this term. So one board cannot bind another. That's sort of the rule of constitutions. The only way you can prevent something from changing from one session to the next is to constitutionally protect it. That's why you do these amendment things, because you remember the gas tax is constitutionally protected. You cannot take money from the gas tax and put it somewhere else that's not a road. It's constantly protected because it's in the Constitution that says that. And no session can change that without going through the amendment process to do that. So that makes it much more sound in its idea, and it will be there without somebody tampering with it in a bill in 1 year, in one session. So.
Oh, I support the extra penny for the recyclers. I think it's getting down to the point where it's getting tough for them to make any kind of a profit. So I think that's probably the way to go. I think they've done polls that say that I believe it's over 70% of Iowans want to keep the bottle bill, because at one time, 2 or 3 years ago, they were talking about maybe even just eliminating the bottle bill as we know it now, and try to get folks maybe to recycle more through your local recycling. I don't think that's what Iowans want. I think our ditches are clean. I think we want to keep it where it's at, and so I'd support the extra penny. I think in reality what some people would say is, well, that will possibly raise the price of a can of beer by 1 penny to the end user, because you're giving that extra penny to the recycler. I think most Iowans would probably say, well, if I got to pay 1 extra penny, it's okay. Maybe they wouldn't, but I think they probably would. That's why I support it. I think we just got to get an extra penny to these folks. And getting it done this year, it just seems like, I agree with what you're saying. We talk about it every year, but nothing ever seems to get done. I think we got to really make this a priority, or else we're going to lose our local recycler here in Carroll pretty soon if we can't get them some help.
So the bill that I sponsored then passed out of the Natural Resources Committee, which I'm a member of, by the way, doesn't raise the nickel side of it at all. Right now, when the provider, the bottler brings their product to a grocery store, the grocery store pays them a nickel. They put that nickel in their back pocket and hold on to it until they have to go back to the redemption center and get their cans back, and at that point they pay the nickel back to the redemption center plus a penny. So here's the numbers as I recall them. Since this started in 1979, I think it's been a wonderful program. It's not involved state dollars anywhere. The system has just worked on its own. That's this whole 79 to 19 is 2020 now, isn't it? So that's what, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years? 40 years is what it is. No. 40? Yeah. So it's worked for 40 years without anybody really getting in their face. The government has stayed out of it. And in that 40 years, not all the bottles have been returned that the original bottler got a nickel for. So he's had this money in his back pocket for 40 years, and that number now, it was told to me could be $30 million they've been able to keep because the cans weren't redeemed. So my plan is to get the extra nickel out of those bottlers. They're the ones that in a few years, if that's not working, then maybe other things would change. But the price of the nickel won't change in this bill. It will stay a nickel. I've had a lot of people say, raise it to 10 cents. Well, then the bottler's going to keep 10 cents in his back pocket for 40 years and only have to spend a penny. I mean, that's pretty good business when you get a nickel and it only costs you a penny. So you might make money unless you were a farmer, and then you couldn't figure that one out either.
All right. Doug Burns from the Times-Herald. Senator, you mentioned that you expressed the opinion that public schools are administrative heavy, that they're top heavy. Do you think that there should be some sort of indexing where the number of administrators are tied to the number of students in a school, or do you think potentially that there are some administrative positions that should just be wiped out, like curriculum director, athletic director, assistant principal? Are there certain roles that we don't need in our schools, or should it just be a flat out like, direct ratio tie administrator to number of schools or number of students?
I think you've been thinking about this, haven't you, Doug? I think it kind of has to be tied to the number of children in your school. I mean, your whole funding system relies on state aid, and many times it's got to be tied to that because the school numbers are what determines, plus property tax, how many dollars a school has available to spend every year. So. Brad Zahn, Senator Zahn, is the expert on these issues, and if you need numbers and details, I can provide them to you pretty quickly. I don't have them with me, but most schools, the larger ones are, of course, the ones that have the most administration. They're probably the biggest committer of overspending for administration than the smaller schools. Most of our smaller schools, just because of that low student census, have to do bare bones administration to get it done. We're sharing administrators in a lot of schools, in small schools in Iowa, and they seem to get that done and survive every year too. So the state cost per pupil now is about $6,800 per child. $6,880, okay. That has, if you compare that to our surrounding states, I think we've raised that more in the last 10 years than probably most of the states around us. I've got those figures here too. You really need to know. I'd look them up. So I don't know if I answer your question. I would support some looking at and tying that administrative cost down a little bit for especially the larger schools.
Since you asked for the follow-up, I'll give you one. Is it just a numbers issue that it should be administrators, or are there some roles that schools, that administrators are in that should be eliminated, like a curriculum director, like somebody that oversees transportation, like athletic directors? It's just numbers, or are there certain administrative roles that we think maybe we should reduce or even eliminate?
I'd say yes to that question, but which ones in particular probably depends on the schools and what they're doing. I know, as my wife was an elementary teacher in the big school of Arweva, they had their curriculum director was one of the teachers that actually just got paid extra to do that. So they couldn't afford to do a full-time, because these are people with lots of initials behind their in front of their name, so they don't come cheaply usually. So. But they worked for years on the curriculum because it was a state mandated thing that they had to do, and it was done basically through the teacher corps that happened. I don't know, my wife crazy, so not as crazy as most, but she doesn't need mental health. Thank you. Or shut up.
That concludes this morning's legislative forum. I would like to thank you both again for hosting us this time, and if I could ask my fellow members of the legislative forum from the chamber to stand, please.